My question is, what are continents and how are they imagined? Africa and Europe exist as separate, can you hear me? Africa and Europe exist as separate places because the people who inhabited them had divergent histories. What about non-human beings on those land masses? Are they African and European in the same way as the human inhabitants? When do we distinguish between Africa, Europe, and their birds? A group from Cambridge University has given this problem some thought.
Who goes there? It is I, Arthur, son of Uther Pendragon from the castle of Camelot, king of the Britons, defeater of the Saxons, sovereign of all England.
Pull the other one.
I am, and this is my trusty servant Patsy. We have ridden the length and breadth of the land in search of knights who will join me in my court at Camelot. I must speak with your lord and master.
What, ridden on a horse?
Yes.
You're using coconuts.
What?
You've got 2 empty halves of coconut and you're banging them together.
So, we have ridden since the snows of winter covered this land, through the kingdom of Mercia, through...
Where'd you get the coconuts?
We found them.
Found them? In Mercia, the coconut's tropical.
What do you mean?
Well, this is a temperate zone.
The swallow may fly south with the sun, or the house martin or the plover may seek warmer climes in winter, yet these are not strangers to our land.
Are you suggesting coconuts migrate?
Not at all. They could be carried.
What? A swallow carrying a coconut?
It could grip it by the husk.
It's not a question of where he grips it. It's a simple question of weight ratios. A 5-ounce bird could not carry a 1-pound coconut.
Well, it doesn't matter. Will you go and tell your master that Arthur from the court of Camelot is here?
Listen, in order to maintain airspeed velocity, a swallow needs to beat its wings 43 times every second, right?
Please!
Am I right?
I'm not interested.
It could be carried by an African swallow. Oh, yeah, an African swallow may be, but not a European swallow, that's my point. Oh, yeah, I agree with that.
Will you ask your master if he wants to join my court at Camelot?
Tonight I'll be telling you some stories and giving some explanations about how Europe, Africa, their human inhabitants, and their birds fit together. I cannot presume that I could ruin the joke of King Arthur, the migrating coconuts, and the African swallows by explaining it. But I'll point out a few reasons why it's funny. At the end of this talk, I'll suggest one way the joke might have been extended. I'll also point out a few ways the skit hints at the high politics of knowledge. As an historian, I'll start at the beginning, and that was a long time ago. I'll start with the birds. Birds had been traveling between Africa and other regions for millennia before humans forged connections through them. Of course, the continents that humans identify with don't have intrinsic meaning to birds or even ornithologists. Contemporary ornithologists divide the avian world into ecozones. Long before anyone realized there was an Africa or a Europe, birds were flying between the Palearctic and the Afrotropical zones. Birds created a network that humans later joined. Let me tell you 3 ways the birds themselves are responsible for particularities about the network between Africa and Europe. First, the birds themselves created a lopsided network. As King Arthur's questioner shrewdly observed, African swallows don't migrate. Northern birds travel to the tropics for their winter and return for their summer breeding season. The intercontinental avian relationship is lopsided because Afrotropical birds do not spend their non-breeding season in Europe. Many Afrotropical birds do migrate, but within that ecozone, not beyond it. Second, huge numbers of birds migrate. It was estimated in the mid-20th century that 196 species participated and that 4.7 billion birds made the trip each year. How do you estimate 4.7 billion? The third way that the birds themselves set up the network is its geography. The migrants from Europe cross a lot of the African continent. Woodlands and savanna provide better wintering grounds than do equatorial forests. So the migrants generally avoid the middle band of the continent. And you see that here, that they're not going to the equatorial forests in the middle. To find savannas and woodlands, birds could take shorter journeys to the areas north of the equator, or longer journeys to the southern hemisphere. Now, distance does not seem to have been the major factor in the choice of destination for migratory birds. Many species fly from northern Europe to southern Africa. A dramatic example is the white stork, with a summer range as far north as the Arctic and a winter range on the south coast of South Africa. The birds, hundreds of species and billions of individuals, have flown vast distances, thousands of feet above humans, since time immemorial. Allow me to borrow from a film many of you probably know, Winged Migrations, to convey these birds' achievement. The computer-generated effects showing birds departing and arriving at recognizable land masses perfectly convey how I want to think about birds and continents. Let's pause to watch. The story I'll tell tonight will insert people into these intercontinental networks created by the birds. We know that Africa and Europe were connected in lots of different ways, but how does the network look when birds and knowledge about them become the form of linkage? In the beginning, the birds flew long distances, but all human knowledge about them was local. People noticed that birds came and went and where they lived. The return and the departure of migrants marked the beginning of seasons. Where they went was unclear and not very important. I found surprisingly few explanations among Africans about where birds went in the off-season. Among the Xhosa, it was thought that migrating quail spent the winter underground, possibly as a frog-like creature. The kite was assumed to go to rocky shelters, where it molted all its feathers. As Peter Mara explained in his lecture this week, some Europeans, including Linnaeus, also suspected that birds went underground. Whether migrants came or went for Africa or to Europe wasn't even a question. Aristotle had a broader vision. He believed that cranes flew to the source of the Nile for the winter, but on the other hand, he also believed that swallows hibernated in trees. When we classify knowledge according to its place in a network, we don't start with its content or its sophistication. Our starting point isn't whether indigenous knowledge, in quotes, held that ABC is true, or whether Western knowledge, in quotes, reduced this and that to such and such. I'll discuss the content of different sorts of knowledge tonight, but only after we have an understanding of the network. My vision is of two kinds of knowledge networks, local and cosmopolitan. My idealized version of local knowledge about birds in Africa and Europe looks like this. Now, this is idealized. This is not all the points we could possibly put there, but I'm just giving an idea of where populations are and how local knowledge could spread. All right, you can see that local does not mean isolated. As continents became more interconnected, knowledge traveled, but through many short links in an aggregation of the local network. Knowledge has a particular character in local networks. It can travel freely and it can go far from its origin, but the provenance and record of the author of the knowledge isn't durable. The science studies theorist Bruno Latour doesn't specifically discuss local knowledge, but he's helpful. He asks us to think of the way proverbs travel freely and widely with no enduring ownership and no restrictions on how they are adapted. We all say an apple a day keeps the doctor away, but someone in the next village might say a pear a day keeps the doctor away, and they have the right to change that because the knowledge isn't durable. Local knowledge can be freely borrowed and altered. Latour calls these soft facts. I'm suggesting that local knowledge transmits soft facts. One step at a time, local knowledge can spread very far, but it loses connection with its origins. Whichever locality has adopted them has full ownership of the knowledge. This is not to say that local knowledge is by definition fleeting and inconsistent, but there have to be reasons for its durability: shared history, shared culture, consistent observation, and economic conditions. All these can promote consistency over space. My point is that the local knowledge network does not have its own built-in mechanism to retain consistency. I'd like to stress that the malleability of local knowledge in Africa refers to its movement through space, not necessarily through time. Many oral societies assign ownership of history to parties, such as lineages or griots, which serves to harden the facts, as long as they remain in the group which is interested in preserving them. Local knowledge and soft facts exist today as a huge percentage of what we here in modern America know and share. Cosmopolitan knowledge, which I'm contrasting with local knowledge, cosmopolitan knowledge and hard facts existed in ancient times. But the guards on the battlement in Arthur's England probably didn't have access to much knowledge that wasn't local. That's one reason that the Monty Python skit is funny, that those people with those accents in that century argued about the difference between African and European swallows is the sort of silly send-up that makes us love the pythons. So having disputed the historical accuracy of the esteemed group from Cambridge, what was known before 1900 about intercontinental bird connections? As I said a minute ago, I haven't been able to learn many theories about where birds went. So instead, I'm going to tell you about how birds could be messengers in both Europe and Africa. The notion was stronger in Africa than in Europe, and it set up Africans to respond to evidence of intercontinental migrations. If you would have suggested to a randomly selected group of Africans in about 1890 that birds could be bearers of important news, messengers of important news and bearers of great power, you would have elicited wide agreement. Not surprisingly, the oldest and most physically impressive evidence, of birds as messengers comes from elaborate royal art, in this case found at Great Zimbabwe. Just to remind you, Great Zimbabwe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the largest stone construction in southern Africa. It was the capital of a state populated by Shona-speaking people from the 12th through the 15th century. A hilltop site high above the people was probably a space for rituals relating to kingship. At this enclosure were 7 soapstone carvings of birds on poles 5 to 6 feet high. These carvings are now known as the Zimbabwe birds. Why did the ancestors of today's Shona put birds in their most powerful ritual spaces? There are no written records, so the best we can do is look at documented understanding of birds of prey among Shona people. Throughout the region, birds of prey are associated with kingship and masculine power. Many stories, expressions, and commonly held beliefs concern the power of 2 species in particular, the bateleur eagle and the African fish eagle. Now these are by my favorite American bird artist, Luis Agassiz Fuertes. I like him better than Audubon. I might be alone in that. Birds of prey, such as the bateleur, a name for acrobat in French, and the fish eagle, which is closely related to our bald eagle, are excellent at soaring. Because they soar between earth and air, these birds resemble humans' departed ancestors. How can I convey the importance of ancestors in sub-Saharan Africa? Throughout sub-Saharan Africa, ancestors are a continual presence to be petitioned and propitiated for the maintenance of individual and social health. The most powerful ancestors were kings. As such, they seem to have had claim on the most powerful symbols. Among the Shona at Great Zimbabwe, these were birds. It's believed that the carved statues of the powerful birds of prey at Great Zimbabwe represent individual past kings. Among the people of southern Africa, it's not just the Shona who associate birds and kinship. The Ovambo people of northern Namibia feature a big bird in their rituals of kingship. The association of these birds of prey and governmental power continues today. And these are the flags of Zambia and Zimbabwe, both of which have birds on them. And the Zimbabwean flag, that's actually one of the soapstone birds at Great Zimbabwe. And this is a fish eagle on the Zambian flag. But birds are not just symbols of power. They are also messengers from powerful beings. Among the Shona, the Bachelor, and the fish eagles are messengers from ancestors and even the high distant god, who usually doesn't get much involved in affairs of people. If you'll allow me to draw on evidence from the late 20th century, consider that the Zimbabwean nationalist guerrillas in the War for Liberation watched eagles to learn when the army of the white government was near. The guerrillas reported the Chipungu eagle was a very important sign. If we saw them, we would take off our shoes and our hats. If they flew down and made a great deal of noise, we knew there was trouble coming and we would leave that place. If they flew about peacefully, we knew they were safe. Now, I had many similar quotations to choose from. The association of eagles and messengers goes beyond the Shona of Zimbabwe. In Zambia, the country just to the north, where over 70 languages are spoken, the newly independent government chose to precede news reports with the call of the fish eagle. Here's a fish eagle, and here's his call. So that was played before news reports. I'll suggest that in independent Zambia, that sound was the equivalent of "This is London." Smaller birds could also be messengers. In fact, the best message you could hope to hear from a bird in Africa was from this one, the honey guide. Here's the sound. By making this sound and fluttering conspicuously around people, the honey guide leads people to bees' hives. People then smoke the hives free of bees, collect the honey, and leave a portion for the little bird, who would let humans, with their technology of fires and axes, do the dangerous work. Honey guides and people co-evolved with each other in opposition to the bees. In the 1980s, a Kenyan-German research team made a research project of following the people who followed the birds. They reported that Boran men summon a honey guide with a piercing whistle. A bird who is interested in taking up the collaboration will appear, make that grating trill, flutter its wings, fan its tail, and take short flights in a consistent direction, never letting the person come too close or stray too far. Boran honey hunters testify that the bird's behavior changes as they come closer to the hive. At the hive, the bird perches high above it, gives a different sort of a call, and waits. If the people are slow to find the hive, the bird may circle around it or set off toward another one, drawing the humans in a new pursuit. The research team calculated that, all things being equal, a Boran man with a taste for honey will search on average for 8.9 hours on his own or for 3.2 hours with the help of a honey guide. It is also said, but sometimes doubted, that these birds also convince badgers to dig out nests for them. All over Africa, it is said that if a person or badger fails to repay the bird, it will lead its next collaborators to a lion, snake, or leopard rather than a beehive. Whether the honey guide actually does mislead is not documented. David Livingstone, who stands out in the 19th century for listening to Africans, wondered about this and asked 114 men about their experiences. He found that only one had been led to anything but a beehive, in his case, an elephant. I could tell you other examples of powerful birds and bird omens from across the continent, but I'll move on. Let me clarify one point. Whoops. Oh, no. If a bird is a messenger or an omen, that doesn't mean it can't also be a source of medicine or a moralistic tale, or that it can't be a snack. I don't mean to suggest that birds were always and only messengers, but they could be. Some birds were not killed or eaten, but most were. It varied over areas. There also does not seem to have been a consistent taboo against birds who were messengers also serving as lunch. What about Europeans before, say, 1850? A very significant group of them thought birds could bring messages, but primarily when they were shot, preserved, and sent in boxes to taxonomists in Europe. Many men went around the world to fill boxes with birds and other natural specimens. These naturalists greatly extended what I call cosmopolitan knowledge. Cosmopolitan knowledge deals in facts that will travel, or hard facts. And once again, this is just a made-up graphic to show you the points. I'm not claiming that, I'm actually representing the network itself. In the 17th century, European men began to travel the world in order to find out about it. They collected and cataloged its flora and fauna and sent the information back to Europe. Their purpose was to accrue a different sort of knowledge that transcended the local. In comparison with the soft facts of local knowledge, early modern natural historians collected hard facts. According to Latour, hard facts are statements that can be transferred from party to party without being transformed. You'll recall that with local knowledge, each party that receives a fact becomes its owner, free to alter it at will. In contrast with hard facts, the author of the fact is preserved and transmitted along with the fact itself. Anytime you quote an authority, you are transmitting a hard fact, presuming you do it accurately. If you do it inaccurately, you can be called to account because someone can always check what you say against what was said by the owner of that fact. Because the author's ownership is preserved, later users need to be careful about how they cite it. What does this have to do with preserved bird skins in boxes? European natural historians collected birds, gave them descriptions and names, and were remembered for doing so. They also created links with each other. A new global community with a different way of knowing formed. I call these densely networked, multi-knowledge communities cosmopolitan. By doing so, I do not mean to say that the knowledge is sophisticated, universal, or even empirically verifiable, but that it was consistent between European-dominated metropoles. People in different places all over could know the same thing, discuss it, and then discover and share more hard facts with each other. That's why this map of cosmopolitan knowledge is so much more densely networked than the local knowledge map. How did cosmopolitan knowledge and African local knowledge interact in this early period? Very often quite nicely. Europeans wanted bird specimens, and Africans were good at providing them. But here's one example of an 18th century clash that epitomizes different values. An early collector in Africa was the Swede Anders Sparman, a student of Linnaeus himself. He published an early description of the honey guide, and the world marveled. But science required a specimen, not a story. Sparman offered rewards to his African assistants if they would capture the bird. All declined. What was worth knowing to the assistants was how to find honey. What was worth knowing to Sparman was the morphology of the bird. He finally shot one himself, but noted his assistants' reactions. Shooting the bird, he reported, quote, offended my bussimans not a little. Different humans had different ideas about what birds could teach them, but all of them, Africans and Europeans alike, had a big surprise coming. They had no idea what these creatures were doing in the skies far above them. For the next few minutes, we'll be talking about storks. In case you don't know them, let me show you a video clip of them nesting in Europe, then making their way around North Africa. This is also from Winged Migrations. Storks perched on human houses in Europe and Africa both, but they kept their secrets until. In 1822, a white stork arrived in Rostock, Germany, with a message for Europeans. When they weren't in Europe, storks were spending their time somewhere that humans use spears. This stork became known as der Pfeilstorch, which means arrow stork, a technically incorrect name because it was a spear, not an arrow, that ran through the bird. This speared bird reminds me of the passenger pigeons in Rachel Berwick's installation, Zugenruhe, each of which is run through by the branch on which it sits. Somehow, der Pfeilstorch was able to live through the spearing, escape its hunter, and even make it back to Germany for the breeding season. A German newspaper alleged that it must have been an African that speared him based on the type of wood and the sort of iron tip. This was a big discovery because in 1822, European naturalists had not been at all certain that the white storks they saw in southern Africa and northern Europe commuted between the two places. Even with the hint delivered by the Pfeilstorch, it wasn't until the late 19th century that some people in Europe thought of tracking bird migrations by marking the birds with inscribed metal bracelets. Such as that. A handful of European ornithologists in Heligoland, Denmark, Ukraine, Budapest, and East Prussia began banding birds. Unlike much scientific research, in the study of avian migration, the birds did the actual traveling and the researchers stayed at home. A new sort of scientific establishment, a bird observatory in Rositten in East Prussia, which is now in Latvia, ringed many birds. Between 1908 and 1913, the Protestant minister and amateur naturalist Johannes Thienemann received news of 48 recoveries in Africa. My earliest evidence of Africans responding to bird rings is from 1909, when a white stork wearing one of Thienemann's bands was shot in Lesotho. A correspondent wrote to the South African Ornithologist Union's journal. I heard some days of a white stork having been shot in January by a native at Marija, the paramount chief's village, about 25 miles from here, with a silver ring attached to its leg. I got the chief to send it in for inspection, as he does not want to part with it, and the ring is still attached to the half-dried leg. It bears the inscription, Vogelwarte Rositten, 1265 Germania. Can one find out the history of the bird, as the natives are much interested in it? This 1909 account from Lesotho is the first I found that presents the people on the southern end of the flyway. The white interlocutor was motivated more to write because of the interests of the Sotho than because of the bird ringer. Rather than make a report, he asked, can one find out the history of the bird, as the natives are much interested in it? Think about this response in the context of birds as messengers from ancestors. Because the Marija villagers sought a translation of the message, news made it back to Thienemann. An intercontinental conversation via birds had begun. Another account of an early find from Malawi in 1930 makes a similar point, and I've actually found only 2 of these early letters, so you'll hear about both of them. The district commissioner of Karanga in Malawi submitted a recovered ring. He reported that the ring was from Hungary, but that its recovery had been delayed 5 years. Here's what he wrote. In 1925 onward the ends of rains, about a month of March, some boys of Kamemi village set a trap. In this trap, they caught a large water bird, described as having very long legs, standing about 3 feet high, black in color, with a white breast, and having a long, straight beak. It was alive when they caught it, and they killed it, and greatly enjoyed eating the flesh. It was found to bear the ring which I attach hereto on its leg. The boys took it to the chief, who looked upon it as a charm, and carried it on the shaft of his spear till his death in 1929, when his successor removed the ring and used it as an ornament on his little finger. In this manner, it came to my notice. Here again, we see continuities with local understandings of an association between the chief and avian messengers from the skies. The boys brought the ring to the chief. The chief and his successor had rights to keep it for its potency. In this case, the finders did not seek out a human interlocutor, even if the ring had writing on it. The value of the ring was that it had been sent. Perhaps these villagers were less literate, less well connected to sympathetic literate whites, or less trusting of white interlocutors than those in Lesotho. But the district officer, who was linked to the world of cosmopolitan science, intervened, and news of the ring did eventually make it back to Hungary. For simplicity's sake, let's imagine just one European center of bird ringing in Rositten, here, where Thienemann was, and let's think about how it collected knowledge about bird migration from around Africa and then made it available to other nodes in the network of cosmopolitan knowledge. So here, the green lines are the flights of ringed birds. And these spots are where they're found. And the blue lines are the reports that made it back to Rositten. And once a report of a ringed bird made it back to Rositten, it could travel without transformation throughout the European network. Now, it could also travel through local networks, but only one step at a time, and possibly and probably changing as it did. It was a less durable fact, the reports of the rings in the local network. So these birds ringing back and forth, news of them is understood differently and transmitted very differently between Europe and Africa. But what about power and knowledge, I hear you asking? So far, I've described the relationship of Africans, Europeans, and birds as nearly accidents of geography and history. Power is invested in knowledge about birds. The authorities at Cambridge University knew this.
Stop! What is your name?
It is Arthur, King of the Britons.
What is your quest?
To seek the Holy Grail.
What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow?
What do you mean? African or European swallow?
Huh? I don't know that.
Who do you know swallows, so much about swallows.
Well, you have to know these things when you're a king, you know.
This is funny because the Pythons didn't think that kings needed to know anything at all about African or European swallows. In actual fact, European imperialists found it helpful to draw a distinction between the two types of birds. Now, this can't be a big surprise to you. In making the assertion that Europeans used bird migration to naturalize imperialism, I've crossed only a low bar of significance. It never took much for Europeans to naturalize imperialism. They could justify their presence anywhere in the world at the drop of a feather. But it's interesting that they did it in specific ways, conditioned by the lopsided migration of northern breeding birds to tropical wintering grounds. Europeans began to conceive of those birds who were born in Europe as European. This conception intensified imperialist tendencies in cosmopolitan knowledge networks. The Swedish nature writer and photographer Bengt Berg once mused to a young crane in Lapland, "A strange thing indeed if one were able to follow you, to see how you comport yourself among the Negroes and crocodiles and birds." Berg decided to follow the birds, loaded with 15 cameras and 20,000 feet of motion picture film. This is 1922. He traveled to Gibraltar, then Egypt and Sudan to determine where the Lapland birds were going. He published an account of his trip. It featured lyrical prose and abundant black and white photographs of birds in the air and on the ground. The book is telling for the way it frames the migration as being between human spaces. Berg found migrants in abundance on the White Nile. He wasn't like today's AV tourist because he displayed only a secondary interest in native African birds. He's not trying to build his list by finding the native birds. He constantly rejoiced to see species of snipe, sandpiper, and the nightingale from Lapland, although he knew he could not claim common citizenship with all members of these species. The sandpiper was born in Kashmir and therefore could understand no Swedish if I'd wanted to speak with him. Sweden was, of course, a country without colonies, but this does not make Sweden acolonial. Berg gave specific consideration to the migrating European swallows discussed by King Arthur's questioners. He asserted that they were unsung imperialists, in a minor way. The apostle of civilization who sets forth for Africa for the purpose of slaughtering elephants will scarcely deign to catch a look at the little northern swallows that flit about his camp and chase away the mosquitoes from his precious head. So the swallows are preventing malaria among the apostles of civilization. Readers in temperate climes were enthused about the story of northern swallows and cranes flying south. It was an international hit, translated into German, Dutch, in 1930 into English and Danish. We'll return to Berg in a minute, but consider now a human traveler from Europe to Tanzania. A British birdwatcher made a lot of the potential connections between whites and European avian migrants in Africa. Cecily Ruggles Bryce from England published her bird notes about Dar es Salaam in the late 1920s. She doesn't say much about herself, except that she was a recreational bird watcher, a motorist, and golfer. Her notes indicated that she saw many species from her car or on the golf course. She wrote with particular feeling about seeing two species of plain, small birds that breed in Britain, the spotted flycatcher and the willow warbler. Look at those sweet, plain, small birds and bear them in mind when you read what she wrote about them. I like to think of the British migrants who spend the cold northern winter with us in East Africa as our bird empire makers. Neither history nor research is ever likely to tell us what impelled the first bird pioneers to venture on so long and arduous a journey. But during the hot season at Dar es Salaam and elsewhere, we are sometimes refreshed by the sight of their descendants, who for thousands of years have forged a link between England and her African empire. And for the sake of that link, migration will always be fraught with significance for us. Bird empire makers. Bird empire makers is a strong statement of European identification with Palearctic avian emissaries. But for Cecily Ruggles Bryce, the first birds to migrate were already identified by continents. Therefore, the first Europeans to insert themselves in African communities were birds. Claiming a common project in citizenship with birds helped Ruggles Bryce naturalize her presence in Africa. Now, her assertion of bird empire makers are ridiculous, and she's the only writer I found who made such a claim. Still, she's useful because she sends us back to the question of when birds can be legitimately considered African or European. So much for Sweden and Britain and migrants to Africa. We'll close with the case of Germany. Germany, you may know, won African territory during the 19th century scramble for Africa, but lost its colonies through the Treaty of Versailles in 1918. Recall that the German ornithologist Johannes Thienemann was one of the first to receive word about a ringed bird when the villagers in Lesotho found one in 1909. Thienemann has been the subject of a recent article by a Belgian historian, Ralph de Bont. From his work, I've learned that Thienemann began his ringing work with the help of crow hunting people on the Baltic. He arranged with crow hunters to catch birds, ring them, and release them. Others hunters elsewhere then caught the crows, ate them, and reported back to him where they'd found the rings. Thienemann attributed his success in this research into intra-European migration to the fact that, quote, no hunter leaves a crow unshot when it flies over within shooting distance. Like many other naturalists at the time, Thienemann was a utilitarian conservationist. He believed good species should be preserved, and while vermin could be rightfully exterminated. He identified himself so much as a hunter that he usually appeared in public in a hunter's hat and boots, even in an official photograph in 1929. And here he is dressed as a hunter. He's a Protestant pastor and a bird ringer. Why do I emphasize Johannes Thienemann's association with European hunters? To provide context for his strong views against Africans hunting European-bred storks. In 1930, he wrote with dismay at the decline of, quote, our deer storks suffered through the effects of terrible hunting by natives. Throughout the 1930s and even after the Second World War, Thienemann, as his successor at the Vogelwarte Rositten, published articles about the dangers that African hunting created for migrant storks. In raising the alarm, Pfeilstorch became a German word. In fact, it's one of those German words with a Wikipedia page in English. I know of no other European language whose speakers became concerned enough about storks stabbed in Africa to invent a word for them. It's because of Thienemann's naming of the phenomenon that you can look, if you look up Pfeilstorch in Google Images today, you can see this photograph. See, and that bird has. So there are still Pfeilstorch here. It is not only one of those Eurocentric double standards that killing crows in Germany was okay while killing storks in Africa wasn't. It was a specifically German double standard. The German hyper-awareness of the migration of its, and I use the possessive advisedly, its birds to Africa led to one last curiosity in the story of empire race and European breeding birds. An article in the German news magazine Der Spiegel in 1994 reported that in 1942, the Nazi SS chief Heinrich Himmler authorized research into whether storks could carry pamphlets to Africa, especially to Afrikaners in South Africa. Many Afrikaners had wanted to remain neutral during the Second World War. Some even sympathized with the Nazis, but they joined the Allies, and Himmler wondered whether he could circumvent the information networks of Free France and Great Britain with storks. Thienemann's successor, Ernst Schütz, advised Himmler that the recovery rate of stork-borne pamphlets would be extremely low. Himmler did not immediately give up the idea, but unfortunately for humanity, he was eventually distracted from his bird research by other projects and never tried to implement it. After the Second World War, however, Afrikaner nationalism waxed in South Africa, and that country developed its own form of extreme racialism, which it called apartheid. The Afrikaner National Party ran on the platform of apartheid in the general elections of 1948 and won. Remember Bengt Berg, the whimsical Swede who wanted to speak to sandpipers on his 1922 trip to Sudan. In 1949, his book was translated into Afrikaans for white South African readers. Until that time, South African nature writing had been virtually limited to English. South Africa is a long way from Sweden and even Sudan. But it's not a mystery why the publishers in Pretoria judged this book to be of interest to South African readers 27 years after the trip. Although it was about birds, the book emphasized a connection between temperate Europe and tropical Africa. Perhaps in 1949, South African readers were pleased to learn that Europe's white birds flew to South Africa too. I want to move toward a conclusion of my talk now and leave you with something other than a sense of the wacky ways that Europeans made imperial claims on migratory birds. Let's return to cosmopolitan networks of knowledge. My argument to you has been that by the mid-20th century, cosmopolitan networks of knowledge were not only centered in Europe, but actively using information collected through collaboration with Africans to justify and promote European privilege. We now live in a post-colonial yet highly stratified world. How did the situation change in the second half of the 20th century? Conservation in Africa exists under colonial legacies that exclude Africans from connections with the environment and the ability to make decisions about it. But many conservationists are aware of this legacy, and programs in Africa are now expected to recognize that African people have a place in the environment and a claim over the African environment. The cosmopolitan network of bird knowledge has also been touched by processes of decolonization. This photograph is from a lesson on bird migration at a South African elementary school. A few Africans have made inroads into scientific networks as professionals. Others collected with them as lay people. I found an interesting file of letters in the Livingstone Museum in Zambia, written by Zambians and citizens of neighboring nations in the 1970s and the 1980s, after they had found Afrotropical birds ringed by the museum. In contrast to the earliest letters that reflected beliefs of bird rings as supernatural interventions from the ancestors, many of these letters addressed the museum directly, with curiosity about ringing programs and queries about the possibilities for education and self-improvement. For example, finding a ring prompted a schoolboy to ask in 1978 about the museum itself. I would like to know a lot of things about this birds with rings and also about other more things concerning the museum. And an employee of the Zambian Library Service wrote a similar but more sophisticated letter in 1972 asking about the project of ringing. I am very interested in this scheme and I would be grateful to you let me know your finding about it. In 1975, a teacher in Zimbabwe was pleased to announce that his students had been connecting with the cosmopolitan network of knowledge even before the ringed birds turned up. It was found by Cosmos Ngube, who brought it to Mayobode School following a science lesson on migratory birds. We therefore inform you that this experiment has tremendously helped us at Mayobode School. It's striking how he preserves the name of the finder of the ring. The teacher is a participant in networks dealing in hard facts. So, this is where Livingstone, Zambia is. And I see this, and these rings were found in the 1970s and the 1980s. I see the Livingstone Museum's place in cosmopolitan networks like this. Some Zambians recognized that it was a node in cosmopolitan knowledge networks and expressed their interest in connecting with it. So here, this red line, this doesn't represent local knowledge, but these are reports of and inquiries about bird rings. And these were two-way. They wanted information back. They're trying to connect with the cosmopolitan network. The reports of bird rings were short distance, but the knowledge was not local. Because Zambia is a poor country, the ornithological network remains less developed than in Europe. Ornithology is not among the sciences most valued by developing nations, so African entrance into the network has been slow and numbers remain small. However, as the network of knowledge expands, so do perspectives. I've only seen one post-colonial rejoinder to European claims to ownership over birds that breed in the Palearctic, but winter in the Afrotropics. This is by the Ghanaian ornithologist Yaa Aintimo-Abaidu, who is addressing her compatriots. She's addressing her Ghanaian compatriots in 1988. If any of you, I'm going to show it to you in a minute. If any of you have heard Peter Mara's talk last week, the resonance between Aintimo-Abaidu's words and his work between the US and the Caribbean will strike you. I'd also like to think that the pythons might have thought that her perspective could have fed them some good material for debates about African and European swallows. I'll give her the last word tonight. The question I've been very often asked by Ghanaians is, why should we protect birds which belong to the British? My reply has been that birds which breed in Europe and winter in Africa normally spend 6 to 8 months in Africa and only some 3 months on their breeding grounds. So if we really want to apportion ownership, they belong to Africa. And that's all I have to say tonight. Thank you. So I can take some questions or comments if you're interested. Yes, Diane.
I was just wondering about, in terms of cosmopolitan networks, what impact, if any, the slave trade and the Silk Road might have had.
Knowledge networks about birds, or?
Yeah, just wondering if there was any knowledge transmitted along those particular axes.
There was hard knowledge, there were hard facts transmitted through Africa because of the slave trade, particularly through Western literate Christian and Arabic sources. However, these aren't societies with mass literacy, and there's not a lot of hard knowledge being transformed. As far as the contacts with the Indian Ocean, so more than the Silk Road, the Indian Ocean, there was also, there were Arabic traders along the Swahili coast from, well, before they were really Arabic traders, but really from about the first centuries in the Common Era. And there are some written sources. Now, these sources are not making it inland, and people, and so unless they're once they move inland and once they become oral, unless there's really a mechanism to preserve those hard facts and a reason to remember where they come from, who they're associated, the specifics about them, it's going to be lost. And even with the slave trade, there was not a strong reason to remember that. So local knowledge about the slave trade had a lot to do with accounts of people being eaten when they went overseas, or people being thrown overboard where they would gather cowrie shells, and that was a way of understanding that the slave trade brought wealth. But hard facts about the slave trade were not transmitted widely in Africa. Yes, Tony.
In European ornithological circles, there was huge campaigns, I'm sure you know, about the netting and killing birds on the migration path between Europe and Africa. And huge attempts are being made to stop this. Much of the killing actually takes place in southern Europe. And I can't say that I've ever come across the phrase, somebody's killing European birds, or British birds, or African birds. Our notion strikes this absurd. And I think the second point is, I rather think you misunderstood Miss Cicely, the double-barrel name.
Ruggles Bryce.
She was simply homesick and finding a familiar European bird in her African neighborhood, a vast distance where she came from, simply reminded her of home.
Yeah. Well, Tienemann, the ornithologist in Germany, did talk about them as being our birds. I mean, that's the evidence I have. And you're talking about the late 20th century, when the networks have, to a certain extent, decolonized. And yes, she was homesick, and no one else said that, but she chose to use the word bird empire makers. And I am saying that she was homesick, and one way she could deal with her homesick and explain her presence there was by recognizing that the same birds were in Dar es Salaam that were at home. Europeans had many, many ways to naturalize their presence. I'm not saying she needed the birds to do this, but I'm saying that this is something they commonly did, and in her case, she used the birds to do it. And it's a fact that the birds bred in Europe that they could be considered European rather than African. Yes?
This is just a question of detail, but do you know from being in the museum archives whether the museum engaged the people that asked for further information, whether people were brought into the network?
I do not know. I imagine they acknowledged the letters, but I'm sure there were no durable links formed. The museum didn't have that kind of funding. Those people were really widely scattered, and museums in Africa don't have such great outreach programs. Yes?
Do you happen to know what happened to the film footage that Barrick shot?
I've never found it. I don't know. I'd be very interested in seeing it. I've seen some newspaper reports that it was shown in the United States, but I've never seen. He has some archives in Sweden, but I haven't made it there. Yes?
Have the colonial textbooks being used in the African schools, plugging at least a certain percentage of the population into these international networks and sort of conditioning people about how to think about birds?
I don't know if the colonial textbooks are used. A lot of textbooks are published by Macmillan. Macmillan Africa, at least in English, provides a large number of the textbooks. And I think they try to provide good textbooks. I think lots of places there aren't enough textbooks, and they might be using old textbooks, but colonial textbooks are pretty old. I don't know to what extent textbooks refer to these birds as European or African. I wouldn't know that. I know in South Africa, history textbooks, which is a completely different subject, and in South Africa, the transition to majority rule has been much later. In South Africa, there are still apartheid history textbooks in use. And that's a real problem. I've never looked into those textbooks. Caroline.
Nancy, I thought that was lovely, so great pleasure to come hear you tonight. From your experience, to what extent have your African respondents accepted Linnaean names or accepted European popular names for these birds?
I think that the concept of a species is pretty consistent across cultures. There are differences, of course. Some species aren't named, and some subspecies aren't recognized. There's more lumping done in Africa than in Europe. But in general, the concept of a species is recognized. So rural people in Africa will still use the names in their own vernaculars about the birds. Once people move to cities, however, they don't have the same contact with birds that they've had in rural areas, and they forget them. So Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing continent, and local bird knowledges are being lost as people urbanize. So bird guides today who decide they want to get a job in showing European birds very often have to go back and learn the vernacular names in order to tell them to tourists, because ecotourists want to know local knowledge. So they have to go back and learn the vernacular names at the same time that they're learning the Latin and the English names. Yes?
I want to say something just about zoology as an attraction of Europeans to Africa altogether. I remember that the Rift Valley in Tanzania was explored because of people saying there's some butterflies originally, and that led to anthropology and archaeology there. So many of the naturalism sites there are related to the Berlin zoos and so on.
Natural history is a very important way Europeans started to collect information about the wider world. And Linnaeus' apostles didn't go out to learn about the people. And Linnaeus' apostles were the first Europeans to go out to collect information about the wider world. And work in anthropology developed out of natural history. There's a really interesting book called Butterflies and Barbarians, which talks about how a missionary started collecting butterflies and then became really a very important influence on later academic anthropologists. A lot of ethnographies were written by naturalists because and they cross disciplines between writing about butterflies and birds and lizards and also about people now and then. So early naturalists really were, they're some of our oldest ethnographic sources for Africa as well. And yeah, I think there was a romantic fascination among Europeans for all parts of the world. They're attracted to Latin America and North America and Asia. Africa has a lot of charismatic megavertebrates and a lot of beautiful birds. Yes?
To what extent have governments achieved some recognition of endangerment and taken action towards certain species that are so recognized? Is that developing there?
Well, there are international treaties, particularly about wetland conservation. There are international treaties that wetlands will be preserved. The organizations that are involved in these international treaties, they realize that these wetlands are only going to be preserved in Africa if there's some kind of a connection to local people and if there's a benefit to local populations. Conservationists working in Africa now no longer say, as they did during the colonial period, that Africans needed to be excluded from the environment or it would be destroyed. They're no longer thinking only of Africans destroying their storks and the African environment. That said, I think monitoring and patrolling and implementing conservation of wetlands can be really, really difficult in very poor countries. All right, thank you very much for coming tonight. I appreciate your attention.